What have you always wanted to know about Boise State Public Radio? Join us for another round Wednesday, March 19th at Mad Swede Brew Hall in downtown Boise from 6 to 8 p.m. Learn more about our operations, news content, and our service mission. We welcome your questions and look forward to sharing more about what we do here at Boise State Public Radio. More details can be found on our website at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Caudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. We're going to spend the next hour getting you updated on the news that made headlines this last week. A lot to cover. And today our panel includes Christina Lords, the editor-in-chief of the Idaho Capital Sun, Kevin Fixler, investigative reporter with Idaho Statesman, Logan Finney with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, Drew Dotson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout, and our very own legislative correspondent, James Dawson. Happy Friday, everybody. Glad you're here.
Hey, Gemma, happy Friday.
Hey.
We did it.
We got here. All right, let's talk the legislature. It is hoping to wrap up this year's session next week, but that may not be happening. Christina, this has to do with unfinished budgets. Can you tell us about this and what's happening?
Yes. So this is an issue we've actually been following for the last 2 years now. After the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, or the legislature's Budget Committee, the committee's co-chairs, Wendy Horman and Scott Groh, made this announcement in 2023 that they were changing the way that JFAC sets budgets and conducts its business. So last year was the first legislative session where they fully implemented these changes, which include creating legislative work groups, which do not meet in public, to discuss budgets for all state agencies. And before, the process was that leaders of these state agencies would come before the committee, give a presentation outlining the goals of their budget proposals, and then the committee would vote on those budgets. That all happened in the morning every day during the committee's public meeting times. But now the process is very different. The legislators on the budget committee are getting a shortened versions of those presentations, not from the state agency directors usually, but by legislative services staff for the most part. The other major change that is affecting all of this is that the committee now considers two versions of the same budget. So they have what's known as, or what's being called, the maintenance budgets, which are essentially the same as the budget from the year prior, with all of what they call the budget enhancements taken out. So the maintenance budgets are the budgets that essentially keep the lights on for state agencies, while the enhancement budgets are where the new requests for more money for things like new employees or new equipment come into play. And the enhancement budgets are what the committee is hung up on now. So originally, the legislative leadership set a target date for adjournment of March 21st, which is next Friday. But these enhancement budgets have stalled the session, and some of the fights and negotiations happening on those budgets is what's holding up this committee. And if the committee can't agree on the budgets, then they don't advance to the House and Senate floors, and then we don't advance to adjournment. It's my understanding that JFAC adjourned today at the call of the chair, which means they don't have a next meeting scheduled. So I think there's still a lot of work that they're working through to find consensus on some of these budgets. And let me tell you that the vibe in JFAC has been very tense lately. Last Friday, there was a visible public fight between members of the committee and the House Speaker, who isn't on the committee but came into the room and was yelling and pointing and arguing in public about where they're at and some of these hangups with negotiations. So it'll be very interesting to continue to follow this. We've been hearing maybe the following week, on March 28th, they may be able to adjourn, but we have some legislators telling us in Republican leadership that we may be here in mid-April. So we'll have a reporter at JFAC every day from here on out, just to make sure nothing else crazy goes on, and we'll keep updating you all as it progresses.
And Christina, for people who aren't aware, in our state constitution, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we have to have a balanced budget, right, in order for the legislature to adjourn. So So sometimes, other legislatures could just go home and sine die.
Correct. So the Idaho Constitution says that this is the legislature's essentially main main reason for being is that we have to set a balanced budget. And so it's the one thing, there's a lot of other bills that they consider throughout the session, but this is the one thing they must get done to adjourn. And I think some people that we've talked to are worried about is that some of the legislators may decide that we have set the budgets. We have set these maintenance budgets that fully fund state agencies and departments, and these enhancement budgets are extra. I would say that most of the state directors and department heads don't view that in the same way. They think that these enhancements are essential to helping people with public services. JFAC sets every budget for every state agency, from health and welfare to, you name it, agriculture, all of the things that Idahoans rely on. And so they have to get this done before they can adjourn.
Mm. Jimmy, even as the legislature is trying to wrap all of this up and get these budgets set, lawmakers are still introducing new bills. Can you tell us about this latest one that came out this week? This would allow public schools to start hiring chaplains.
Yeah, that's right. So it would allow districts, it'd be completely optional. Each district could set their own policies related to this. They could have these religious figures as a paid employee or a volunteer, and they could hire more than one chaplain at a time. The bill doesn't specifically require any chaplain to be affiliated with a particular religion. They would have to undergo a criminal background check, like substitute teachers and other educational staff. And basically, it just would be entirely left up to the school district to put limitations on who chaplains interact with, whether that's solely educators and other staff members, or if they could also talk to students. So this is being pitched as essentially, hey, chaplains, even if you're not affiliated with their particular religion or brand of Christianity, whatever it happens to be, they can help you through tough situations. Schools are these kind of pressure cookers, as we all know, the different stresses that staff members, teachers, and students alike, have to deal with day in and day out, and seemingly become more and more stressful each year. And so they believe that this could be one way to help alleviate that kind of stress. Of course, you have other people who say, this completely violates the separation of church and state, even if, people happen to agree with, a certain chaplain's religious worldview, right? This was just a basic introductory hearing that we saw this week, and still would need any, public hearing before it could reach the House floor.
Okay, appreciate that update, Jimmy. Drew, let's move away from the State House for a minute and talk about what's happening with some employees with the Payette Boise National Forest, because they were fired. This was due to these sweeping firings that Doge did, and they've now been reinstated. But take us back to them losing their jobs and the reporting you first did on that.
Sure. So this goes back to early February, right around actually Valentine's Day. There was about 60, that's basically the number across the Boise and the Payette National Forest, probationary employees who were fired as part of this initial wave of workforce reduction efforts by Doge. These people were kind of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, as probationary employees. Although that doesn't, in many cases, that doesn't mean they were new hires or new to the Forest Service. Some of them were, they'd been working for the Forest Service for decades and had just recently gotten a promotion or changed positions. And so that would lead to that probationary tag being applied. And essentially, they were fired under the guise of performance-based issues. Although in many cases, these employees had no blemishes on their performance records, and in fact, often had just received exemplary marks on recent evaluations. And so, nonetheless, that was kind of the first wave of the firings, and like I said, about 61 employees across the Boise and Payette National Forests were affected by that.
But they were reinstated earlier this week. So tell us what that means, Drew.
Yeah, so there have, of course, been several legal challenges kind of
Mm-hmm.
parallel to those probationary firings. Earlier this month, there was a ruling by a United States District Court judge that essentially said that the Office of Personnel Management, which is the agency that ordered the firings to the various different federal agencies, did not have the authority to do so. At the same time, a union representing federal employees filed a grievance in response to those firings, and the Merit Systems Protection Board last week issued a 45-day stay to basically continue weighing the merits of that grievance. The stay is they're essentially, the board has said that yes, there is a case here, we're going to look into it further, but it is not a it's not to say that this is over. As part
Mm-hmm.
of that stay, the USDA was ordered to reinstate the fired probationary employees, and so that happened as of Tuesday. They released a statement reinstating them. And the reinstatement does not mean that these people are back to work. It simply means they are being paid again, and they will receive back pay to the date they were fired.
And Drew, I know you've talked with some of these employees, and I mean, of course, they're all happy to be being paid again and to be getting this back pay. Here's the issue, though, for some of them is that this stay is only in place until what, April 18th or so. So, you know, do you look for another job? Do you not? I mean, there seems to be such instability on a federal level on what's going on, and then you have all of these lawsuits, as you mentioned. That's got to be really disconcerting for someone, who needs a job. And let's be very clear, it's not cheap to live in Valley County.
No, you've got it exactly right. It's been described to me as a cloud of uncertainty. Over the last month for these employees, there's of course been a range of emotions. The ones I've heard the most are shock, anger, confusion, depression, even fear, loneliness. They've kind of been through the gamut, and the personal stories you hear associated with this, some of them are unbelievable. I spoke with a gal this week who she has been off and on with the Payette since 2023 in fisheries and in wildlife. And it's kind of, her dream job, as these jobs are for many of the people I've spoken with. They don't want to work anywhere else. This is where they would choose
Mm-hmm.
to work over anywhere. Um, she was furloughed for the winter season in November, and she went home to Kentucky. Well, she got word that she would report back for duty on February 10th, and so she drove back to Idaho, back to McCall from Kentucky. And 4 days later, she was fired. So she
Mm.
spent all that money to come back out here, to move back out to McCall, and then the rug was pulled out from under her. Um, now she's reinstated. She's got the back pay. That helps, but she's already moved on. She's accepted a new position with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. That starts at the end of April. And so, if she gets the go ahead to return to duty for the Payette, before then, she will. She's excited about that, but she kind of had to make the tough call to secure her own future, because even with this 45-day stay through April 18th, there's no guarantee. And that's what all of
Mm-hmm.
these employees are up against. It's this tricky equation of, you've got this job you love, and maybe it'll be there for you in a couple months, but maybe it won't be. And so when do you just pull the plug and move on? That's the debate all these employees are having right now. And really, it extends beyond just the probationary employees too, because there was another initiative called Reduction in Force that is going to apply more broadly, not just to probationary employees. Federal agencies had a deadline of yesterday to submit plans for further workforce cuts under this reduction in
Mm.
force. And so this cloud of uncertainty, these feelings of angst, it's not limited just to probationaries. It's kind of across the board right now at the Forest Service.
Yeah, every department for sure. So, Kevin, at the end of July, the murder case against Brian Koberger, the man accused of killing four University of Idaho students, will begin. And we've recently found out some of what the defense plans on arguing. Can you fill us in on this?
There have been quite a few developments in this case just this month. The latest comes in a filing from the prosecution. And what we've learned is that they're projecting that the defense for Brian Koberger will allege that there's good support, actually, that their client's DNA was found on a knife sheath discovered at the crime scene. Uh, they won't dispute that, according to the prosecution. So instead, they're going to have to explain away to the jury why that piece of evidence ended up inside the home in Moscow where the four students were found dead. And part of that may be, again, according to the prosecution's filing, is that the evidence was either placed there or planted there. They're going to have to find a way to explain that away. And even Brian Koberger's lead attorney, Ann Taylor, has acknowledged that this is ultimately the biggest question for the jury. A quote from a January hearing, she said, "What does a knife sheath mean at the crime scene?" So that's the biggest development lately. But there's also been, we're in the midst of what's called the motions in limine. And essentially, that's where
Mm-hmm.
two sides are, pardon me, attempting to create guardrails about what can be said at a trial. Some of the things that have been brought forward from each side are even words that can be used at trial, things like whether or not the prosecution can use the word murder or murder weapon. The defense is attempting to limit the ability for anyone to speak about Brian Koberger as a sociopath or a psychopath. Meanwhile, the state is pushing to limit the defense from arguing that the state is trying to kill their client as part of the death penalty push.
Hmm. All right. And so, with all of that, Kevin, I mean, all of this is going on as we are approaching the trial date. Which, once all of this is figured out, then you have to seat a jury, which I am assuming is going to take some time.
Yes, they've set aside currently about a week and a half, and what we're hearing is that they may call thousands of jurors from Ada County. As you'll recall,
Mm-hmm.
this case is moved from Latah County, Moscow, the city up there, and part of the rationale and justification by the defense was that a jury that could offer a fair trial to their clients could not be seated, and so the judge agreed to move the trial, and ultimately the Idaho Supreme Court established that in Boise and has chosen a new judge.
All right. Appreciate the update on that, Kevin. Drew, it looks like Valley County may be updating its zoning to govern land that surrounds McCall. And this has to do with what's called the McCall impact area. Can we begin with you explaining what that is, what the McCall impact area is?
Sure. So it's really just a planning boundary. You've got McCall city limits, in which case the city of McCall has jurisdiction over zoning and things of that nature. And then there's the McCall impact area that surrounds city limits. It varies as far as how far it goes. But essentially all the way around Payette Lake, west to basically the Adams County line, or Club Hill Boulevard, kind of near Little Ski Hill,
Mm-hmm.
east to roughly Little Payette Lake, and then south to about Elo Road. And so essentially, what's unique about this zone, this impact area, is that it's county land. It's Valley County has jurisdiction, has final say on any land use decisions in the impact area. However, the county has agreed to apply zoning codes that very closely resemble those in place within city limits. And so essentially, it's a transitional zone where it's not technically in city limits, but for the sake of planning, it's managed very similarly.
So, why the potential change, Drew?
Yeah, so last year, April 2024, the Idaho legislature adopted new rules governing impact areas, one of which, as part of that, required a review of existing impact areas. The new law established new criteria, including geographical boundaries, the
Hmm.
availability of public service utilities like water and sewer, other public service district boundaries. But really, the key one was that there needs to be a likelihood that land within impact areas will be annexed into the city within 5 years. Previously, it was something like, within a reasonable time in the future. There was no
Hmm.
prescribed timeline. Now there is. And in McCall's case, the impact area has been around nearly 50 years and is largely unchanged. Most of the land in the impact area has not been annexed. And there are serious questions as to whether the public service utility, water and sewer, whether those systems are capable of annexing a lot of this land around the impact area. And so that's why we're here now.
What's the likelihood that this will go into effect, Drew? And if so, when could it happen?
It will go into effect. There's no doubt about that. There's a
Okay.
deadline by the end of this year. The city and the county have to work this out. The county has ultimate say. Right now, the city is planning to present a revised impact area boundary map later this spring, and then they'll continue hashing it out from there. One important thing to note with all this, and really this is the what what the what the argument is over, is where the city of McCall uses traditional zoning where designations are applied to swaths of land that forecast what appropriate land uses are. The county does not operate that way. The county does
Mm,
not have zoning at all. It simply evaluates development proposals on a case-by-case basis, using a compatibility test with surrounding properties. And so that's really what this battle is about. There's a lot of people who look at Lake Fork, south of McCall and north of Donnelly, and kind of the commercial sprawl that's happened along Idaho 55 there, and have concerns about that running clear up to McCall. And so that's really what the argument over here is
mm.
what will that entrance along Idaho 55 into McCall look like moving forward?
Logan, let me bring you into the conversation real quick. Don't mean to put you on the spot, but I think you've been covering this, right? Kind of from more of a legislative angle because of this zoning issue.
No, not the zoning issues, but I do have some credit to give Drew in just a moment.
Okay. Okay. I appreciate that. All right. With that said, Logan, I do have a question for you. And that is about a bill that's been approved that could reform and modernize how the state collects taxes from power utility companies. Can you talk to us about that? And then what you wanted to talk about in regards to Drew?
Sure. Yeah, this is an issue that has been kind of quietly percolating in the background at the State House for a few years now. As everybody is likely aware, most of funding for local governments, your cities and counties, comes from property taxes. And here in Idaho, property taxes are calculated based on market value, which is assessed by your local county assessor. So it's the local county assessor that goes through every 5 years and determines if you sold this property, how much it would be worth, and that's the basis for our taxes. However, there are other there are some kind of unique properties that sprawl all over the state, and it really doesn't make sense to have locally elected county officials do it for the same type of property in every county across the state. We're thinking of things like railroads, power transmission lines, and substations. This is a specific class of property that's what's called operating property, and it's what the utility is using to do its business across the state. So it's classified a little bit differently than like a big box store or agricultural land and whatnot. And so there are some federal laws about how railroads have to be taxed for property taxes. There's a long history, especially out here in the West, of states trying to crack down on railroads and make sure they're paying their fair share. And what that ended up causing at the federal level is a law that says you have to treat railroads fairly and have to treat their operating property like other classes of operating property. Here in Idaho, what that has turned into was a series of lawsuits at the local level, where the power companies, Vista Avista Utilities up in northern Idaho and Idaho Power for much of the rest of the state, they sued the state saying that they were not being their transmission lines and whatnot, their operating property was not being evaluated fairly, and it should have been evaluated on par with the railroads. That's a lot of context for me to sum up
Mm-hmm.
to what has happened this legislative session, but we've finally gotten to the point where lawmakers have been looking at how to perhaps tax these power utilities in a different way rather than doing property taxes through this centrally assessed property, their transmission lines, which are being assessed currently by the Idaho State Tax Commission. So the state has lost this lawsuit, and the court has ruled yes, the counties have been calculating property taxes for these power companies at too high of a rate. And so this is where Drew's reporting comes in because he got some of this information at the local Valley County Commission meeting where they were actually discussing just how much money they specifically owe back to Idaho Power. And it's an instance where 43 of the 44 counties, I believe it was all of them except for Boundary County, owe some back taxes to the power companies.
Wow.
The legislature has finally gotten to a point where they've decided we're not going to be charging property taxes on the utilities anymore. What we're going to move to in the future, assuming this bill passes and is signed into law, in the future, they would be taxing the electric companies on a kilowatt hour tax and the gas companies on a therm tax. So it's based on like how much heat they're providing. And this has all been done and calculated in such a way that the local taxing districts, the cities, counties, school districts, etc., they should be getting approximately the same amount of money as they were when it was property taxes. And basically, the state and lawmakers have negotiated with the utilities to where if we continued doing this in a property tax basis, the utilities would be paying less than they have in the past. But they've kind of agreed to set up this new taxing scheme and try and keep the funding stable for the local counties. But I do want to give Drew credit because he's done some great reporting on the actual details of just how much of a financial hit this is going to mean for counties that owe money back.
So Idaho will now be allowed to use the firing squad for death penalty executions. And Jimmy and Kevin, I know both of you have been covering this. So Jimmy, I want to start with you. Can you give us the background on this bill and why it was brought forward?
Boy, I mean, this has been a long time coming.
Mhm.
Really, ever since like the early 2010s, when these European pharmaceutical companies that manufactured lethal injection drugs or drugs that were used for lethal injections, I should say, uh, basically told states, we're not going to export these drugs to you because you're just going to use them to kill people, and that's not something we agree with. So, starting around that time, then states all across the country with the death penalty were going through their entire inventories of these drugs. They were expiring or they were being used, and Idaho was no exception. And so in the past, I don't know, I want to say recently, 4 or 5 years, as they've been considering starting to execute members of death row here in Idaho, these drugs have been very hard to obtain. And
Mhm.
we saw that they did get some last year when they attempted to execute Thomas Creech. That execution attempt was unsuccessful because they couldn't find a suitable vein to access, over the course of, I think it was an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. And so they had to postpone that. And then the drugs that the state did get expired in November. And, they feel like, and when I say they, I mean supporters of the death penalty slash these
Mhm.
lawmakers who are pushing these bills felt like we needed a more reliable method. So the firing squad last year was authorized as a secondary method if we couldn't get the drugs, and now this would make it the primary method with lethal injection as kind of a backstop if for whatever reason we couldn't carry out a firing squad execution. So basically supporters are saying this is going to be a much more reliable way to finally carry out capital punishment as opposed to the lethal injection method, which was tenuous just because of supply chain issues, but also
Mhm.
legal battles that would stretch out for in some cases decades.
So with that said, Kevin, as Jimmy mentioned, this more reliable what source of execution. But some lawmakers are also saying this is a more humane way to execute prisoners. Can you tell us what they mean by that?
Sure thing. This is really a push from Representative Bruce Skog, who doubles as the House Judiciary Committee chair. This is the second such bill that he's brought forward. As Jimmy mentioned, in a prior year, firing squad was brought back to Idaho as a backup method, but now we're reprioritizing. This bill, which the governor signed on Wednesday, the firing squad becomes the primary starting in July of 2026, and part of that is so that they can retrofit the existing execution chamber. Meanwhile, they can use existing lethal injection drugs to execute, the top priority prisoners. But in terms of whether or not it's more humane, it's obviously a debate. But the idea from Bruce Skog is that this is quick and it's certain. Whereas, as we experienced with the attempted execution of Thomas Creech, he laid on a gurney for about an hour, and they were unable to end his life. And so some have actually called what occurred to him cruel and unusual punishment. His attorneys actually are in the midst of another legal challenge, arguing that to attempt to execute him again would represent cruel and unusual punishment. And he's under a current federal stay of execution as that winds its way through the courts. Just the opposite. The only Republican in the Senate to vote against this bill was Dan Foreman out of Moscow. He's a former combat veteran and also a retired police officer. He says that he has seen people shot to death in his line of work. And he says this is the absolute opposite of humane. One other note I'll add is that I've spoken with a national death penalty expert. Her name is Deborah Deno. She's an academic out of Fordham Law School in New York. And the way she approaches this is saying that the firing squad is actually the least inhumane, meaning that it's not clear if any method is humane, but among the options available, this may be the best route to ensure that it's effective. And to Bruce Skogg's point, it's quick, it's certain, and it leaves no question whether or not the attempt to execute a prisoner is successful.
Jimmy, as Kevin mentioned, though, this will become the primary source in 2026 because Idaho isn't ready to make this the primary source. So how will that work? I mean, do we know? I mean, don't they have to build? I read like some type of facility. I mean, what about the people who will have to, be the person on the other side of that weapon doing this?
Yeah, so many things left, to be determined. So as you mentioned, the facility would need to be built, designed and constructed, which they've had trouble getting someone to design that. The legislature 2 years ago set aside $750,000 for this project. It went out to bid a couple times with, no one being awarded that contract. So I don't know if they're going to find someone in the next, year and a half before this takes effect to actually get that across the finish line. If they do, I mean, you have so many considerations. You have to have, a backstop for these bullets after they, exit the body of the death row inmate to make sure that no one, is going to get hurt other than them. Lots of different design challenges there. It's going to take a while, not to mention that Representative Bruce Skog said they would probably need another $250,000 to actually finish this project, which he says, can come out of the Idaho Department of Corrections existing budget. Basically tell Director Josh Tewalt to go find it. So there's that. And as for, the person behind these weapons, we don't know exactly what sort of procedures will be followed because IDOC still needs to write them. They are the ones in charge of putting together the protocols. You had Representative Skog saying that it could be mechanized, so have some kind of I don't know if it'd be robotic or just some sort of mechanical operation of the firearm where someone maybe pushes a button and it's zeroed in on the death row inmate's heart. Other states have multiple volunteers fire these rounds into the inmate. Some have blanks, some don't. It kind of varies state to state. So these documents and policies and procedures are something that we're going to be looking out for in the coming months too.
Mm-hmm. Christina, Governor Little also signed another bill recently, which will soon become law. This is increasing the grocery tax credit. Can you tell us about this and what this means for the average Idahoan?
Yes. So, like you mentioned, Governor Brad Little signed into law an increase in the grocery tax credit. That's the tax credit that all Idahoans receive to offset the costs of sales tax on food and groceries when they file their taxes. The majority of U.S. states at this point don't tax food, and we actually heard a lot about this issue before the session even began. There were some rumblings out there that this would be the year that Idaho finally eliminates the grocery tax. This has been an issue for the legislature for a very long time. It's been an issue, or there's been talk of this since I started covering the legislature in 2013. But the bill that was supported by the majority of the legislature this year and is now passed into law doesn't eliminate the tax. It instead increases the tax credit for most Idahoans from $120 to $155, which is a $35 increase per year. Some conservative Republicans were really frustrated that this bill didn't go far enough, but supporters of increasing the tax credit say that leaving the sales tax on groceries in place means that we can still get some of that money from tourists that come into Idaho and buy food, and that removing the sales tax completely would be essentially create a larger hole in the state's general fund. And to that point, increasing the sales tax credit through this bill is estimated to cost the state's general fund about $50 million. I think it's also important to just mention that this isn't the only policy being considered this year that would affect the general fund. Governor Little proposed about $100 million in tax cuts for fiscal year 2026. But Republicans in the legislature are actually pushing for $450 million worth of tax cuts. Opponents say that would really blow a huge hole in the general fund without a plan to replace those dollars. So some of those other bills that might affect the general fund are still making their way through the legislative process and to the governor. He did sign a decrease of the income tax that people pay and things like that. So a lot going on financially. And this kind of ties back into the JFAT conversation that we had earlier of, how much money does the state actually have and how much of this can we actually afford?
Yeah, absolutely. Jimmy, Idahoans will be voting next year on an amendment that will decide whether or not to prohibit citizens from legalizing marijuana or other drugs through a ballot initiative. This sounds kind of confusing, but how did this come about?
Yeah, it's very confusing. Basically, bottom line, should citizens be allowed to legalize marijuana or any other drugs through a ballot initiative, or should the legislature be the only one, the only governmental body able to make those decisions? That's basically what it comes down to. So this particular constitutional amendment would put that solely in the hands of the legislators. So this kind of has been rumbling in the background for a while. Certainly, the threat of legalizing marijuana through a ballot initiative has kind of been a boogeyman for a lot of lawmakers, at least in the last 5 years, if not longer, especially after Medicaid expansion got on the ballot in 2018. That's when we saw the crackdown on adding more restrictions to the initiative process, et cetera, et cetera. So supporters of this basically say the legislature is the ultimate form of representative government. We are a constitutional and democratic republic here in the United States. We are not a direct democracy, and therefore this is such an important issue that those sorts of decisions should be solely in the hands of legislators who are elected by the people, as opposed to the people, proposing legislation themselves through the ballot initiative process. This will come up, like you said, on the ballot in November 2026. seemingly all public polling, that I've seen over years and years of covering state legislatures across the country, showed that most people support some form of legalized marijuana, whether that's decriminalizing marijuana, legalizing recreational marijuana, or medical marijuana. Idaho is one of the very few states that hasn't legalized it in any sort of form. So I don't necessarily see the chances of this going super well, but they're still a year and a half away. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars will probably be put into these campaigns to sway voters one way or the other. We'll just have to see.
The Idaho House rejected a call for a constitutional convention. What does that mean? Because my understanding is lawmakers decided against this, but it was not on a partisan level.
Yeah, this is like one of the nerdiest constitutional things that you can think of with American government. Quick rundown. There are two ways to amend the U.S. Constitution. One is if you get a certain number of congressional votes to propose an amendment, then 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. This hasn't happened for a very long time. And what has never happened is an Article 5 Convention of the States, which means 2/3 of states vote to call this convention together and then vote on proposed amendments. Like you said, definitely isn't clean along party lines. Basically, supporters say, yes, we can propose like one or two things that we can debate and then potentially pass and amend the constitution of the country. Whereas detractors are like, no, there are no rules for a constitutional convention. So basically everything would be up for grabs, whether that's, limiting gun rights or getting rid of the First Amendment, things like this that, could just completely go off the rails. And that's what we saw in the debate, those sorts of concerns raised. And ultimately, people who were much more cautious about that sort of approach to amending the Constitution won out.
Christina, I have about 2 minutes left, but I want to get to the fact that Idaho Democrats are sticking with their current leader. Talk to us about this.
Yeah, so the Idaho Democratic Party State Central Committee voted on March 8th to retain Lauren Necochea as party chairwoman. People may know her from also serving in the Idaho House and from some of her other advocacy work on children's and healthcare issues. She says she's really proud of the work that the party has done, especially to find Democratic candidates to run for office, especially for legislative positions. In 2024, the Democrats ran 87 candidates for the 105 open legislative seats, and that's double what the party ran in legislative races 2 years before in 2022. She said for the future, the party is really focusing on pushing back against some of these Trump administration changes and policy moves, especially with federal employee firings and some of the other major possible cuts to Medicaid that the Republican Party is considering. So familiar face, and she'll be around for a little bit longer.
Well, I want to thank all of you so much for all of the reporting that you do and also taking the time to take time out of your busy schedule to come on our roundtable. So a big thank you to Christina Lord. She is the editor-in-chief of the Idaho Capital Sun, Kevin Fixler, investigative reporter with the Idaho Statesman, Logan Finney with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, Drew Dotson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout, and our very own legislative correspondent, James Dawson. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudette.